Autobiography of Anthony Trollope, on Novels and the Art of Writing Them. It is nearly 20 years since I proposed to myself to write a history of English prose fiction. I shall never do it now, but the subject is so good a one that I recommend it heartily to some man of letters, who shall at the same time be indefatigable and light-handed. I acknowledge that I broke down in the task, because I could not endure the labour in addition to the other labours of my life. Though the book might be charming, the work was very much the reverse. It came to have a terrible aspect to me, as did that proposition that I should sit out all the May meetings of a season. According to my plan of such a history, it would be necessary to read an infinity of novels, and not only to read them, but so to read them as to point out the excellences of those which are the most excellent, and to explain the defects of those which, though defective, had still reached sufficient reputation to make them worthy of notice. I did read many after this fashion, and here and there I have the criticisms which I wrote. In regard to many, they were written on some blank page within the book. I have not, however, even a list of the books so criticised. I think that the Arcadia was the first, and Ivanhoe the last. My plan, as I settled it at last, had been to begin with Robinson Crusoe, which is the earliest really popular novel which we have in our language, and to continue the review so as to include the works of all English novelists of reputation, except those who might still be living when my task should be completed. But when Dickens and Bulwer died, my spirit flagged, and that which I had already found to be very difficult had become almost impossible to me at my then period of life. I began my own studies on the subject with works much earlier than Robinson Crusoe, and made my way through a variety of novels which were necessary for my purpose, but which in the reading gave me no pleasure whatever. I never worked harder than at the Arcadia, or read more detestable trash than the stories written by Mrs. Aphra Behn. But these two were necessary to my purpose, which was not only to give an estimate of the novels as I found them, but to describe how it had come to pass that the English novels of the present day have become what they are, to point out the effects which they have produced, and to inquire whether their great popularity has on the whole done good or evil to the people who read them. I still think that the book is one well worthy to be written. I intended to write that book to vindicate my own profession as a novelist, and also to vindicate that public taste in literature which has created and nourished the profession which I follow. And I was stirred up to make such an attempt by a conviction that there still exists among us Englishmen a prejudice in respect to novels which might perhaps be lessened by such a work. This prejudice is not against the reading of novels, as is proved by their general acceptance among us, but it exists strongly in reference to the appreciation in which they are professed to be held, and it robs them of much of that high character which they may claim to have earned by their grace, their honesty, and good teaching. No man can work long at any trade without being brought to consider much whether that which he is daily doing tends to evil or to good. I have written many novels, and have known many writers of novels, and I can assert that such thoughts have been strong with them and with myself. But in acknowledging that these writers have received from the public a full measure of credit for such genius, ingenuity, or perseverance as may have been displayed, I feel that there is still wanting to them a just appreciation of the excellence of their calling, and a general understanding of the high nature of the work which they perform. By the common consent of all mankind who have read, poetry takes the highest place in literature. That nobility of expression, and all but divine grace of words, which she is bound to attain before she can make her footing good, is not compatible with prose. Indeed, it is that which turns prose into poetry. When that has been in truth achieved, the reader knows that the writer has soared above the earth, and can teach his lessons somewhat as a god might teach. He who sits down to write his tale in prose makes no such attempt, nor does he dream that the poet's honour is within his reach. But his teaching is of the same nature, and his lessons all tend to the same end. By either, false sentiments may be fostered, false notions of humanity may be engendered, false honour, false love, false worship may be created. By either, vice instead of virtue may be taught. But by each equally may true honour, true love, true worship, and true humanity be inculcated, and that will be the greatest teacher who will spread such truth the widest. But at present much as novels are bought and read, there exists still an idea, a feeling, which is very prevalent, that novels at their best are but innocent. Young men and women, and old men and women too, read more of them than of poetry, because such reading is easier than the reading of poetry, but they read them, as men eat pastry after dinner, not without some inward conviction that the taste is vain if not vicious. I take upon myself to say that it is neither vicious nor vain. But all writers of fiction who have desired to think well of their own work will probably have had doubts on their minds before they have arrived at this conclusion. Thinking much of my own daily labour and of its nature, I felt myself at first to be much afflicted, and then to be deeply grieved by the opinion expressed by wise and thinking men as to the work done by novelists. But when by degrees I dared to examine and sift the sayings of such men, I found them to be sometimes silly and often arrogant. I began to inquire what had been the nature of English novels since they first became common in our own language, and to be desirous of ascertaining whether they had done harm or good. I could well remember that in my own young days they had not taken that undisputed possession of drawing rooms which they now hold. 50 years ago, when George IV. Was king, they were not indeed treated as Lydia had been forced to treat them in the preceding reign, when on the approach of elders Peregrine Pickle was hidden beneath the bolster, and Lord Ainsworth put away under the sofa. But the families in which an unrestricted permission was given for the reading of novels were very few, and from many they were altogether banished. The high poetic genius and correct morality of Walter Scott had not altogether succeeded in making men and women understand that lessons which were good in poetry could not be bad in prose. I remember that in those days an embargo was laid upon novel reading as a pursuit, which was to the novelist a much heavier tax than that want of full appreciation which I now complain. There is, we all know, no such embargo now. May we not say that people of an age to read have got too much power into their own hands to endure any very complete embargo? Novels are read right and left, above stairs and below, in town houses and in country parsonages, by young countesses and by farmers' daughters, by old lawyers and by young students. It has not only come to pass that a special provision of them has to be made for the godly, but that the provision so made must now include books which a few years since the godly would have thought to be profane. It was this necessity which, a few years since, induced the editor of Good Words to apply to me for a novel, which indeed when supplied was rejected, but which now probably, owing to further change in the same direction, would have been accepted. If such be the case, if the extension of novel reading be so wide as I have described it, then very much good or harm must be done by novels. The amusement of the time can hardly be the only result of any book that is read, and certainly not so with a novel, which appeals especially to the imagination and solicits the sympathy of the young. A vast proportion of the teaching of the day, greater probably than many of us have acknowledged to ourselves, comes from these books, which are in the hands of all readers. It is from them that girls learn what is expected from them, and what they are to expect when lovers come, and also from them that young men unconsciously learn what are, or should be, or may be, the charms of love, though I fancy that few young men will think so little of their natural instincts and powers as to believe that I am right in saying so. Many other lessons are also taught. In these times when the desire to be honest is pressed so hard, is so violently assaulted by the ambition to be great, in which riches are the easiest road to greatness, when the temptations to which men are subjected dull their eyes to the perfected iniquities of others, when it is so hard for a man to decide vigorously that the pitch which so many are handling will defile him if it be touched, men's conduct will be actuated much by that which is from day to day depicted to them as leading to glorious or inglorious results. The woman who is described as having obtained all that the world holds to be precious, by lavishing her charms and her caresses unworthily and heartlessly, will induce other women to do the same with theirs, as will she who is made interesting by exhibitions of bold passion teach others to be spuriously passionate. The young man who in a novel becomes a hero, perhaps a member of Parliament, and almost a Prime Minister, by trickery, falsehood, and flash cleverness, will have many followers, whose attempts to rise in the world ought to lie heavily on the conscience of the novelists who create fictitious Cagliostros. There are Jack Sheppards other than those who break into houses and out of prisons, Macheaths who deserve the gallows more than Gay's hero. Thinking of all this, as novelists surely must do, as I certainly have done through my whole career, it becomes to him a matter of deep conscience how he shall handle those characters by whose words and doings he hopes to interest his readers. It will very frequently be the case that he will be tempted to sacrifice something for effect, to say a word or two here, or to draw a picture there, for which he feels that he has the power, and which when spoken or drawn would be alluring. The regions of absolute vice are foul and odious. The savour of them, till custom has hardened the palate and the nose, is disgusting. In these he will hardly tread. But there are outskirts on these regions, on which sweet-smelling flowers seem to grow, and grass to be green. It is in these border-lands that the danger lies. The novelist may not be dull. If he commit that fault he can do neither harm nor good. He must please, and the flowers and the grass in these neutral territories sometimes seem to give him so easy an opportunity of pleasing. The writer of stories must please, or he will be nothing. And he must teach whether he wish to teach or no. How shall he teach lessons of virtue, and at the same time make himself a delight to his readers? That sermons are not in themselves often thought to be agreeable, we all know. Nor are disquisitions on moral philosophy supposed to be pleasant reading for our idle hours. But the novelist, if he have a conscience, must preach his sermons with the same purpose as the clergyman, and must have his own system of ethics. If he can do this efficiently, if he can make virtue alluring and vice ugly, while he charms his readers instead of wearying them, then I think Mr. Carlyle need not call him distressed, nor talk of that long ear of fiction, nor question whether he be or not the most foolish of existing mortals. I think that many have done so many that we English novelists may boast as a class that has been the general result of our own work. Looking back to the past generation, I may say with certainty that such was the operation of the novels of Miss Edgeworth, Miss Austen, and Walter Scott. Coming down to my own times, I find such to have been the teaching of Thackeray, of Dickens, and of George Eliot. Speaking, as I shall speak to any who read these words, with that absence of self-personality which the dead may claim, I will boast that such has been the result of my own writing. Can any one, by search through the works of the 6 great English novelists I have named, find a scene, a passage, or word that would teach a girl to be immodest or a man to be dishonest? When men in their pages have been described as dishonest and women as immodest, have they not ever been punished? It is not for the novelist to say, baldly and simply, because you lied here, or were heartless there, because you, Lydia Bennet, forgot the lessons of your honest home, or you, Earl Leicester, were false through your ambition, or you, Beatrix, loved too well the glitter of the world, therefore you shall be scourged with scourges either in this world or in the next. But it is for him to show, as he carries on in his tale, that his Lydia, or his Leicester, or his Beatrix will be dishonoured in the estimation of all readers by his or her vices. Let a woman be drawn clever, beautiful, attractive, so as to make men love her, and women almost envy her, and let her be made also heartless, unfeminine, and ambitious of evil grandeur, as was Beatrix, what a danger is there not in such a character? To the novelist who shall handle it, what peril of doing harm? But if at last it have been so handled that every girl who reads of Beatrix shall say, "Oh, not like that, let me not be like that," and that every youth shall say, "Let me not have such a one as that to press to my bosom, anything rather than that," then will not the novelist have preached his sermon as perhaps no clergyman can preach it? Very much of a novelist's work must appertain to the intercourse between young men and young women. It is admitted that a novel can hardly be made interesting or successful without love. Some few might be named, but even in those the attempt breaks down, and the softness of love is found to be necessary to complete the story. Pickwick has been named as an exception to the rule, but even in Pickwick there are 3 or 4 sets of lovers, whose little amatory longings give a softness to the work. I tried it once with Miss Mackenzie, but had to make her fall in love at last. In this frequent allusion to the passion which most stirs the imagination of the young, there must be danger. Of that the writer of fiction is probably well aware. Then the question has to be asked, whether the danger may not be so averted that good may be the result, and to be answered. In one respect the necessity of dealing with love is advantageous, advantageous from the very circumstance which has made love necessary to all novelists. It is necessary because the passion is one which interests or has interested all. Everyone feels it, has felt it, or expects to feel it, or else rejects it with an eagerness which still perpetuates the interest. If the novelist, therefore, can so handle the subject as to do good by his handling, as to teach wholesome lessons in regard to love, the good which he does will be very wide. If I can teach politicians that they can do their business better by truth than by falsehood, I do a great service. But it is done to a limited number of persons. But if I can make young men and women believe that truth in love will make them happy, then, if my writings be popular, I shall have a very large class of pupils. No doubt the cause for that fear which did exist as to novels arose from an idea that the matter of love would be treated in an inflammatory and generally unwholesome manner. "Madam," says Sir Anthony in the play, "a circulating library in a town is an evergreen tree of diabolical knowledge. It blossoms through the year, and depend on it, Mrs. Malaprop, and they who are so fond of handling the leaves will long for the fruit at last." Sir Anthony was no doubt right, but he takes it for granted that the longing for the fruit is an evil. The novelist who writes of love thinks differently, and thinks that the honest love of an honest man is a treasure which a good girl may fairly hope to win, and that if she can be taught to wish only for that, she will have been taught to entertain only wholesome wishes. I can easily believe that a girl should be taught to wish to love by reading how Laura Bell loved Pendennis. Pendennis was not in truth a very worthy man, nor did he make a very good husband, but the girl's love was so beautiful, and the wife's love when she became a wife so womanlike, and at the same time so sweet, so unselfish, so wifely, so worshipful, in the sense in which wives are told they ought to worship their husband, that I cannot believe that any girl can be injured or even not benefited by reading of Laura's love. There once used to be many who thought, and probably there still are some even here in England, who think, that a girl should hear nothing of love till the time in which she is to be married. That no doubt was the opinion of Sir Anthony Absolute and of Mrs. Malaprop. But I am hardly disposed to believe that the old system was more favourable than ours to the purity of manners. Lydia Languish, though she was constrained by fear of her aunt to hide the book, yet had Peregrine Pickle in her collection. While human nature talks of love so forcibly, it can hardly serve our turn to be silent on the subject. Naturam expellas furca, tamen usque recurrat. There are countries in which it has been in accordance with the manner of the upper classes that the girl should be brought to marry the man almost out of the nursery, or rather, perhaps, out of the convent, without having enjoyed that freedom of thought which the reading of novels and of poetry will certainly produce. But I do not know that the marriages so made have been thought to be happier than our own. Among English novels of the present day, and among English novelists, a great division is made. There are sensational novels and anti-sensational, sensational novelists and anti-sensational, sensational readers and anti-sensational. The novelists who are considered to be anti-sensational are generally called realistic. I am realistic. My friend Wilkie Collins is generally supposed to be sensational. The readers who prefer the one are supposed to take delight in the elucidation of character. Those who hold by the other are charmed by the continuation and gradual development of a plot. All this is, I think, a mistake, which mistake arises from the inability of the imperfect artist to be at the same time realistic and sensational. A good novel should be both, and both in the highest degree. If a novel fail in either, there is a failure in art. Let those readers who believe that they do not like sensational scenes in novels think of some of those passages from our great novelists which have charmed them the most, of Rebecca in the castle with Ivanhoe, of Burleigh in the cave with Morton, of the mad lady tearing the veil of the expectant bride in Jane Eyre, of Lady Castlewood, as in her indignation she explains to the Duke of Hamilton Henry Esmond's right to be present at the marriage of his Grace with Beatrix. May I add, of Lady Mason, as she makes her confession at the feet of Sir Peregrine Orme. Will any one say that the authors of these passages have sinned in their being over-sensational? No doubt a string of horrible incidents bound together without truth in detail, and told as affecting personages without character, wooden blocks who cannot make themselves known to the reader as men and women, does not instruct or amuse, or even fill the mind with awe. Horrors heaped upon horrors, which are horrors only in themselves, and not as touching any recognised and known person, are not tragic, and soon cease even to horrify. And such would-be tragic elements of a story may be increased without end and without difficulty. I may tell you of a woman murdered in the same street with you, in the next house, that she was a wife murdered by her husband, a bride, not yet a week a wife. I may add to it for ever. I may say that the murderer roasted her alive. There is no end to it. I may declare that a former wife was treated with equal barbarity, and may assert that as the murderer was led away to execution he declared his only sorrow, his only regret to be that he could not live to treat a third wife after the same fashion. There is nothing so easy as the creation and the cumulation of fearful incidents after this fashion. If such creation and cumulation be the beginning and the end of the novelist's work, and novels have been written which seem to be without other attractions, nothing can be more dull or more useless. But not on that account are we averse to tragedy in prose fiction. As in poetry, so in prose, he who can deal adequately with tragic elements is a greater artist, and reaches a greater aim than the writer whose efforts never carry him above the mild walks of everyday life. The Bride of Lammermoor is a tragedy throughout, in spite of its comic elements. The Life of Lady Castlewood, of whom I have spoken, is a tragedy. Rochester's wretched thraldom to his mad wife, in Jane Eyre, is a tragedy. But these stories charm us not simply because they are tragic, but because we feel that men and women with flesh and blood, creatures with whom we can sympathize, are struggling amidst their woes. It all lies in that. No novel is anything, for the purposes either of comedy or tragedy, unless the reader can sympathize with the characters whose name he finds upon the pages. Let an author so tell his tale as to touch his reader's heart and draw his tears, and he has so far done his work well. Truth let there be, truth of description, truth of character, human truth as to men and women. If there be such truth, I do not know that a novel can be too sensational. I did intend, when I meditated that history of English fiction, to include within its pages some rules for the writing of novels, or I might perhaps say with more modesty, to offer some advice on the art to such tyros in it as might be willing to take advantage of the experience of an old hand. But the matter would, I fear, be too long for this episode, and I am not sure that I have as yet got the rules quite settled in my own mind. I will, however, say a few words on one or two points which my own practice has pointed out to me. I have from the first felt sure that the writer, when he sits down to commence his novel, should do so not because he has to tell a story, but because he has a story to tell. The novelist's first novel will generally have sprung from the right cause. Some series of events, or some development of character, will have presented itself to his imagination, and this he feels so strongly that he thinks he can present his picture in strong and agreeable language to others. He sits down and tells his story because he has a story to tell, as you, my friend, when you have heard something which has at once tickled your fancy or moved your pathos, will hurry to tell it to the first person you meet. But when that first novel has been received graciously by the public and has made for itself a success, then the writer, naturally feeling that the writing of novels is within his grasp, looks about for something to tell in another. He cudgels his brains, not always successfully, and sits down to write, not because he has something which he burns to tell, but because he feels it to be incumbent on him to be telling something. As you, my friend, if you are very successful in the telling of that first story, will become ambitious of further story-telling, and will look out for anecdotes, in the narration of which you will not improbably sometimes distress your audience. So it has been with many novelists, who, after some good work, perhaps after very much good work, have distressed their audience because they have gone on with their work till their work has become simply a trade with them. Need I make a list of such, seeing that it would contain the names of those who have been the greatest in the art of British novel writing? They have at last become weary of that portion of a novelist's work which is of all the most essential to success. That a man as he grows old should feel the labour of writing to be a fatigue is natural enough, but a man to whom writing has become a habit may write well though he be fatigued. But the weary novelist refuses any longer to give his mind to that work of observation and reception from which has come his power, without which work his power cannot be continued, which work should be going on not only when he is at his desk, but in all his walks abroad, in all his movements through the world, in all his intercourse with his fellow creatures. He has become a novelist, as another has become a poet, because he has in those walks abroad, unconsciously for the most part, been drawing in matter from all that he has seen and heard. But this has not been done without labour, even when the labour has been unconscious. Then there comes a time when he shuts his eyes and shuts his ears. When we talk of memory fading as age comes on, it is such shutting of eyes and ears that we mean. The things around cease to interest us, and we cannot exercise our minds upon them. To the novelist thus wearied there comes the demand for further novels. He does not know his own defect, and even if he did, he does not wish to abandon his own profession. He still writes, but he writes because he has to tell a story, not because he has a story to tell. What reader of novels has not felt the woodenness of this mode of telling? The characters do not live and move, but are cut out of blocks and are propped against the wall. The incidents are arranged in certain lines, the arrangement being as palpable to the reader as it has been to the writer, but do not follow each other as results naturally demanded by previous action. The reader can never feel, as he ought to feel, that only for that flame of the eye, only for that angry word, only for that moment of weakness, all might have been different. The course of the tale is one piece of stiff mechanism in which there is no room for a doubt. These, it may be said, are reflections which I, being an old novelist, might make useful to myself for discontinuing my work, but can hardly be needed by those tyros of whom I have spoken. That they are applicable to myself I readily admit, but I also find that they apply to many beginners. Some of us who are old fail at last because we are old. It would be well that each of us should say to himself, Solve senescentum mature sanus equum, ne pecet ad extremum ridendus. But many young fail also because they endeavour to tell stories when they have none to tell. And this comes from idleness rather than from innate incapacity. The mind has not been sufficiently at work when the tale has been commenced, nor is it kept sufficiently at work as the tale is continued. I have never troubled myself much about the construction of plots, and am not now insisting specially on thoroughness in a branch of work in which I myself have not been very thorough. I am not sure that the construction of a perfected plot has been at any period within my power. But the novelist has other aims than the elucidation of his plot. He desires to make his readers so intimately acquainted with his characters that the creatures of his brain should be to them speaking, moving, living human creatures. This he can never do unless he know those fictitious personages himself, and he can never know them unless he can live with them in the full reality of established intimacy. They must be with him as he lies down to sleep and as he wakes from his dreams. He must learn to hate them and to love them. He must argue with them, quarrel with them, forgive them, and even submit to them. He must know of them whether they be cold-blooded or passionate, whether true or false, and how far true, and how far false. The depth and the breadth and the narrowness and the shallowness of each should be clear to him. And as here, in our outer world, we know that men and women change, become worse or better as temptation or conscience may guide them, so should these creations of his change, and every change should be noted by him. On the last day of each month recorded, every person in his novel should be a month older than on the first. If the would-be novelists have aptitudes that way, all this will come to him without much struggling. But if it do not come, I think he can only make novels of wood. It is so that I have lived with my characters, and thence has come whatever success I have obtained. There is a gallery of them, and of all in that gallery I may say that I know the tone of the voice, and the colour of the hair, every flame of the eye, and the very clothes they wear. Of each man I could assert whether he would have said these or the other words. Of every woman, whether she would have then smiled or so have frowned. When I should feel that this intimacy ceases, then I shall know that the old horse should be turned out to grass. That I shall feel it when I ought to feel it, I will by no means say. I do not know that I am at all wiser than Gil Blas's canon. But I do know that the power indicated is one without which the teller of tales cannot tell them to any good effect. The language in which the novelist is to put forth his story, the colours with which he is to paint his picture, must of course be to him matter of much consideration. Let him have all other possible gifts, imagination, observation, erudition, and industry, they will avail him nothing for his purpose, unless he can put forth his work in pleasant words. If he be confused, tedious, harsh, or unharmonious, readers will certainly reject him. The reading of a volume of history or on science may represent itself as a duty, and though the duty may by a bad style be made very disagreeable, the conscientious reader will perhaps perform it. But the novelist will be assisted by no such feeling. Any reader may reject his work without the burden of a sin. It is the first necessity of his position that he make himself pleasant. To do this, much more is necessary than to write correctly. He may indeed be pleasant without being correct, as I think can be proved by the works of more than one distinguished novelist. But he must be intelligible, intelligible without trouble, and he must be harmonious. Any writer who has read even a little will know what is meant by the word intelligible. It is not sufficient that there be a meaning that may be hammered out of the sentence, but that the language should be so pellucid that the meaning should be rendered without an effort of the reader, and not only some proposition of meaning, but the very sense, no more and no less, which the writer has intended to put into his words. What Macaulay says should be remembered by all writers: "How little the all-important art of making meaning pellucid is studied now! Hardly any popular author except myself thinks of it." The language used should be as ready and as efficient a conductor of the mind of the writer to the mind of the reader as is the electric spark which passes from one battery to another battery. In all written matter the spark should carry everything, but in matters recondite the recipient will search to see that he misses nothing, and that he takes nothing away too much. The novelist cannot expect that any such search will be made. A young writer who will acknowledge the truth of what I am saying will often feel himself tempted by the difficulties of language to tell himself some one little doubtful passage, some single collocation of words, which is not quite what it ought to be, will not matter. I know well what a stumbling block such a passage may be, but he should leave none such behind him as he goes on. The habit of writing clearly soon comes to the writer who is a severe critic to himself. As to that harmonious expression which I think is required, I shall find it more difficult to express my meaning. It will be granted, I think, by readers that such a style may be rough, and yet both forcible and intelligible, but it will seldom come to pass that a novel written in a rough style will be popular, and less often that a novelist who habitually uses such a style will become so. The harmony which is required must come from the practice of the ear. There are few ears naturally so dull that they cannot, if time be allowed to them, decide whether a sentence when read be or be not harmonious. And the sense of such harmony grows on the ear, when the intelligence has once informed itself as to what is and what is not harmonious. The boy, for instance, who learns with accuracy the prosody of a Sapphic stanza, and has received through his intelligence a knowledge of its parts, will soon tell by his ear whether a Sapphic stanza be or be not correct. Take a girl endowed with gifts of music, well instructed in her art, with perfect ear, and read to her such a stanza with two words transposed, as, for instance, Mercury nam te docilis magistro, movit Amphion canendo lapides, tuc testudo resonare septum, calida nervis. And she will find no halt in the rhythm. But a schoolboy with none of her musical acquirements or capacities, who has, however, become familiar with the metres of the poet, will at once discover the fault. And so will the writer become familiar with what is harmonious in prose. But in order that familiarity may serve him in his business, he must so train his ear that he shall be able to weigh the rhythm of every word as it falls from his pen. This, when it has been done for a time, even for a short time, will become so habitual to him that he will have appreciated the metrical duration of every syllable before it shall have dared to show itself upon paper. The art of the orator is the same. He knows beforehand how each sound which he is about to utter will affect the force of his climax. If a writer will do so, he will charm his readers, though his readers will probably not know how they have been charmed. In writing a novel, the author soon becomes aware that a burden of many pages is before him. Circumstances require that he should cover a certain and generally not a very confined space. Short novels are not popular with readers generally. Critics often complain of the ordinary length of novels, of the 3 volumes to which they are subjected, but few novels which have attained great success in England have been told in fewer pages. The novel writer who sticks to novel writing as his profession will certainly find that this burden of length is incumbent on him. How shall he carry his burden to the end? How shall he cover his space? Many great artists have by their practice opposed the doctrine which I now propose to teach, but they have succeeded, I think, in spite of their fault and by dint of their greatness. There should be no episodes in a novel. Every sentence, every word, through all those pages, should tend to the telling of the story. Such episodes distract the attention of the reader, and always do so disagreeably. Who has not felt this to be the case, even with The Curious and Pertinent, and with The History of the Man on the Hill? And if it be so with Cervantes and Fielding, who can hope to succeed? Though the novel which you have to write must be long, let it all be one. And this exclusion of episodes should be carried down into the smallest details. Every sentence and every word used should tend to the telling of the story. But, the young novelist will say, with so many pages before me to be filled, how shall I succeed if I thus confine myself? How am I to know beforehand what space this story of mine will require? There must be the 3 volumes, or the certain number of magazine pages which I have contracted to supply. If I may not be discursive, should occasion require, how shall I complete my task? The painter suits the size of his canvas to his subject, and must I in my art stretch my subject to my canvas? This undoubtedly must be done by the novelist, and if he will learn his business, may be done without injury to his effect. He may not paint different pictures on the same canvas, which he will do if he allow himself to wander away to matters outside his own story. But by studying proportion in his work, he may teach himself so to tell his story that it shall naturally fall into the required length. Though his story should be all one, yet it may have many parts. Though the plot itself may require but few characters, it may be so enlarged as to find its full development in many. There may be subsidiary plots, which shall all tend to the elucidation of the main story, and which will take their places as part of the one and same work. As there may be many figures on a canvas, which shall not to the spectator seem to form themselves into separate pictures. There is no portion of a novelist's work in which this fault of episodes is so common as in the dialogue. It is so easy to make any 2 persons talk on any casual subject with which the writer presumes himself to be conversant. Literature, philosophy, politics, or sport may thus be handled in a loosely discursive style, and the writer, while indulging himself and filling his pages, is apt to think that he is pleasing his reader. I think he can make no greater mistake. The dialogue is generally the most agreeable part of a novel, but it is only so as long as it tends in some way to the telling of the main story. It need not seem to be confined to that, but it should always have a tendency in that direction. The unconscious critical acumen of a reader is both just and severe. When a long dialogue on extraneous matter reaches his mind, he at once feels that he is being cheated into taking something which he did not bargain to accept when he took up that novel. He does not at that moment require politics or philosophy, but he wants a story. He will not perhaps be able to say in so many words that at some certain point the dialogue has deviated from the story, but when it does so he will feel it, and the feeling will be unpleasant. Let the intending novel writer, if he doubt this, read one of Bulwer's novels, in which there is very much to charm, and then ask himself whether he has not been offended by devious conversations. And the dialogue, on which the modern novelist in consulting the taste of his probable readers must depend most, has to be constrained also by other rules. The writer may tell much of his story in conversations, but he may only do so by putting such words into the mouths of his personages as persons so situated would probably use. He is not allowed, for the sake of his tale, to make his characters give utterance to long speeches, such as are not commonly heard from men and women. The ordinary talk of ordinary people is carried on in short, sharp, expressive sentences, which very frequently are never completed. the language of which even among educated people is often incorrect. The novel writer, in constructing his dialogue, must so steer between absolute accuracy of language, which would give to his conversation an air of pedantry, and the slovenly inaccuracy of ordinary talkers, which if closely followed would offend by an appearance of grimace, as to produce upon the ear of his readers a sense of reality. If he be quite real, he will seem to attempt to be funny. If he be quite correct, he will seem to be unreal. And above all, let the speeches be short. No character should utter much above a dozen words at a breath, unless the writer can justify to himself a longer flood of speech by the specialty of the occasion. In all this, human nature must be the novel writer's guide. No doubt effective novels have been written in which human nature has been set at defiance. I might name Caleb Williams as one, and Adam Blair as another. But the exceptions are not more than enough to prove the rule. But in following human nature he must remember that he does so with a pen in his hand, and that the reader who will appreciate human nature will also demand artistic ability and literary aptitude. The young novelist will probably ask, or more probably bethink himself, how he is to acquire that knowledge of human nature which will tell him with accuracy what men and women would say in this or that position. He must acquire it as the compositor, who is to print his words, has learned the art of distributing his type, by constant and intelligent practice. Unless it be given to him to listen and to observe, so to carry away, as it were, the manners of people in his memory, as to be able to say to himself with assurance that these words might have been said in a given position, and that those other words could not have been said, I do not think that in these days he can succeed as a novelist. And then let him beware of creating tedium. Who has not felt the charm of a spoken story up to a certain point, and then suddenly become aware that it has become too long, and is the reverse of charming? It is not only that the entire book may have this fault, but that this fault may occur in chapters, and passages, and pages, and paragraphs. I know no guard against this so likely to be effective as the feeling of the writer himself. When once the sense that the thing is becoming long has grown upon him, he may be sure that it will grow upon his readers. I see the smile of some who will declare to themselves that the words of a writer will never be tedious to himself. Of the writer of whom this may be truly said, it may be said with equal truth that he will always be tedious to his reader. End of chapter 12.